first scientist, Ibn Al-Haytham. First of all, may I briefly introduce to you our guest speaker. Mr. Bradley Steffens is a novelist, a poet, an award-winning author of more than 60 non-fiction books for children and young adults, including Ibn Al-Haytham, first scientist. The first full biography of the 11th century Islamic polymath to be published in the West. Mr. Steffens is a two-time winner of the San Diego Book Award for Best Children's and Young Adult Nonfiction. His Giants won the 2005 award and his Rolling garnered the 2007 prize. He also received the Theodore Award for Best Book by a San Diego County author in 2007. Mr. Steffens' first novel, The Prisoner of Al-Hakim, has received glowing reviews. Blue Minaret writes, the story of Ibn Al-Haytham has now been fictionalized masterfully by Mr. Bradley Steffens. Warda Books also stated, this period novel dating back to the Abbasid and Fatimid Caliphate brings to the fore an oft-forgotten side of polymaths, such as Al-Hasan ibn Al-Haytham, as a person that, like all of us, experiences doubt, fear, and love, the fountain adds. From the very first page, Mr. Steffens brilliantly brings Al-Hasan's internal character to life on the page, sketching a conflicted, fascinating portrait of a reluctant hero. Physicist, author, and BBC broadcaster Jim Al-Khalili comments, Ibn Al-Haytham, one of the greatest scholars in history, whose real life was one of the most colorful and fascinating ever told by historians, has been brought to life in a work of fiction utterly brilliantly by Mr. Steffens. The reader is transported 1,000 years into the medieval Arabia. This is a gripping story based on real-life events that are fizzing with adventure and rich inaccurate historical and scientific nuggets. This is just a brief biography of Mr. Steffens. Dear participants, we will post a link with a survey for you to evaluate the session, please. So just fill it in order to be able to analyze and see how we can improve the future session. I would like to inform our viewers and audience that we are live on the ICYF Facebook page, YouTube, and Twitter as well. And I also would like to reiterate to you that you can type your questions and I will read it to our guest speaker. Distinguished participants, respected viewers and audience, please join me in welcoming Mr. Bradley Steffens. Sir, the floor is all yours. Could you unmute your microphone, sir, please? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Fareed, for that wonderful introduction.
You are welcome, Mr. Brad.
Hello to everyone. There might be a little bit of delay when I speak, but I'm sure they'll let me know if I start to break up too much. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank the cabinet and the organization for inviting me. I created a little PowerPoint to go through my important points, so I'm going to just switch over to that. And I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to stop my video. So you can still hear me, correct?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So one of the questions that I'm often asked is, how is it that I, a children's and young adult book author in California, came to write the first biography of Ibn Al-Haytham and subsequently novels about Ibn Al-Haytham? And the answer to that is kind of an intriguing story, actually. Well, let's see. Hang on one second. I got to try something here. There we go. So in 1992, I wrote a book called Photography, and it was in a series called The Encyclopedia of Discovery and Invention. And in that series, the first chapter had to do with pre-invention technology. Then the second chapter had to do with the invention, And then the following chapters had to do with the impact of the invention. So in the chapter about pre-invention technology, the most important item was what they call the camera obscura, which is Italian for darkened room. And it's a dark room with a small opening or aperture that lets light inside from outside, and a few of the light rays pass through this opening and project onto a screen or a wall beyond. Now, the first person to accurately describe this, the physics of it, was Ibn Al-Haytham. It had been observed before, but Ibn Al-Haytham wrote about it in his book of optics. And he performed an experiment with 3 lights on a table, a screen with an aperture in the middle, and then a wall beyond. And what he did was he would put out one of the lamps, and he would see that the lamp in a direct line from it, on a diagonal from it, also went out. And then he would repeat it with a lamp from the other side and the other side. And he was establishing his hypothesis that light rays travel in straight lines. Now, I went on and I wrote the book, but it struck me that they used the word experiment, because when I was in school, I was taught that the first person to conduct experiments was Galileo Galilei, who lived in the 15 and 1600s. And he had conducted an experiment to test Aristotle's theory about falling bodies. He climbed to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he dropped 2 cannonballs of different weights off the side. Aristotle said that the heavier weight would fall more quickly than the lighter weight. But what Galileo found was that both weights fell at exactly the same rate and hit the ground together. And he was credited as being the first person to actually conduct experiments to test hypotheses. And this, I was taught, was the beginning of modern science. Now, just for review, let's talk about what science is. It's really a discipline that follows a specific methodology. And that method is called the scientific method. It consists of statement of the problem, observation about the problem, the forming of a hypothesis or a possible explanation, experimentation to test if that hypothesis is correct, analysis of the experiment, the formation of a conclusion, and then this is very important, the publication of the results so that other people can verify the results. Science is not a private thing. It's done publicly so that other people can verify if the conclusions are true. Now, some people think that Aristotle himself was the first scientist. He lived in 384 BC, and he wrote a great deal about nature and science. And he followed a method. He stated the problem, he observed, he formed a hypothesis, but then he used logic and persuasive reasoning to come to a conclusion. Then he would, of course, he did talk, or he did publish his works. And for this reason, Aristotle leads the way. But the problem with Aristotle, of course, is he skips that all-important 4th step. He did not conduct experiments to test his ideas. Therefore, people couldn't verify his experiments and see if he was correct. That's why many people talked about Galileo as the first scientist. And in fact, Frederick Aiken wrote a book, Galileo, the First Modern Scientist. But other people look further back. They say, well, Leonardo da Vinci, who lived about 100 years earlier, he also conducted experiments. When people found his notebooks, it was full of dissections and various mechanical devices. One problem with Leonardo is he kept all of this private in his notebooks. He didn't share it with anyone, and there was no verification of his results. But even so, Michael White wrote a book called Leonardo, the First Scientist. But then other people looked further back at the British cleric Roger Bacon, who was educated at Oxford and taught at the University of Paris. And when he was in Paris, he met a man named Peter Peregrinus. And Peregrinus worked with magnets and magnetism, and Bacon wrote, Peter Peregrinus shares knowledge of matters of nature, medicine, and alchemy through experiment. And Bacon became a big proponent of experiment, and for that reason, Brian Clegg wrote the book, The First Scientist, The Life of Roger Bacon. But what's interesting is that in his most important work called Opus Majus, in book 5 of Opus Majus, he talks about experiments of light and vision, and he doesn't take credit. He doesn't say that they are his experiments. He refers to another scientist that he calls the physicist, and this other scientist actually did these experiments and wrote in Arabic, and that, of course, was Al-Hasan Ibn Al-Haytham. And he lived about 200 years before Bacon. So this is really the beginning of modern science. Now, I was looking for a publisher and a new publisher, and I proposed doing a book about Emily Dickinson. I had written a book in 1996 about Emily Dickinson, and I pitched this idea to this new publisher. And they were interested in working with me, but they weren't that interested in doing a book about Emily Dickinson. And they said, do you have any other ideas? And I want to pause here because if they had said yes to the Dickinson book, we wouldn't all be here today. But they said no to the Dickinson book. And that was a great gift to me. Sometimes we think that when people say no, that it's really a bad thing. But sometimes no is the best thing that can happen to you. Because in my case, it made me think of Ibn Al-Haytham. I had always been fascinated with him because of the idea that why are people saying he was conducting experiments 600 years before Galileo? So I pitched the idea of doing a book about Ibn Al-Haytham. Now, to be the subject of a biography, you have to be an important person. And I realized that he was an important person in the Middle East, even though many people in the West, hardly anyone had ever heard of him. But of course, he's on the 10,000 dinar bill, the second largest currency bill in Iraq. In 1969, Pakistan issued a stamp commemorating his 1000th birthday. He's been on stamps in Qatar, Jordan, Malawi. The U.S. Vision and Optical Company that makes contact lenses, Bausch and Lomb, they did a poster talking about Ibn Al-Haytham and his contribution to optics. There are hospitals named after him. And they're in the Middle East. There I am in Doha in front of Ibn Al-Haytham Optics. So there are lots of stores named after him. There are pharmacies named after him. He's a very important figure in the Middle East. Then the question, and there's a crater on the moon named after him. So the question became, did I have enough information to write a book? Now, he wrote about 200 books and treatises, of which maybe 60 have survived. And of those, only about 5 or 6 have been translated into English. But what was important to me was his book of optics, his most important book, was translated into English directly from the Arabic in 1989 by Dr. A.I. Sabra of Harvard University. And there had been other translations of his work, but they were based on the medieval Latin translations. Dr. Sabra worked from the oldest existing copy of the Book of Optics. So Ibn Al-Haytham's copy has been lost. But this copy was made by Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Jafar al-Askari. Now this manuscript, I understand, is in Istanbul. I'm in the library in Istanbul. He says, and you can see down at the bottom, that he was the person who made the copy. It was by his hand, directly from the author's copy of the book, and he claims to be the son-in-law of Ibn al-Haytham. So This is the most complete and the oldest version of the manuscript. There are also secondary sources, stories that were told about him that Dr. Sabra put into an entry in the Dictionary of Scientific Biography. Now, this article was about 18 pages long. Only 1.5 pages are biography. The rest of the article was talking about Ibn Al-Haytham's work. But he says in the article that Ibn Al-Haytham had written an autobiography when he was 63 years old. And Dr. Sabra sort of dismissed it as rather general. But I thought this would be a fantastic thing to have, because then I would be able to explain why he did what he did in his own words. So in 1969, there was a book published. There was a conference commemorating his 1000th birthday held in Islamabad, Pakistan. And they published the proceedings of that conference in a book. And I was looking through this book, and there on page 82 was an article by Nazir Ahmed Nazir, and he says that he has the letter, and he translated. He said, here's the letter, which runs as follows. And you can see from my highlighting, the letter begins about where my highlighting begins and ends sort of after where the highlighting ends. I used almost all of that letter in my book. You can see I handwrote the footnote number that corresponded to each quote that I took from that letter. The letter was absolutely fascinating. One of the most important things he says, why is he doing what he did? And he says, it became my belief that for gaining access to the effulgence and closeness to God, there is no better way than that of searching for truth and knowledge. I saw that I can reach the truth only through concepts whose matter is sensible and whose form is rational. When I discovered what Aristotle had done, I became engrossed in my desire to understand philosophy wholeheartedly. Now, philosophy today is a discipline of mainly pure thinking, abstract thinking, but Ibn Al-Haytham explains it this way. He says there are 3 disciplines which go to make philosophy: mathematics, physical sciences, and theology. As long as I live, I shall keep myself pressed into the service of these disciplines. Now, mathematics was something he was extremely gifted at, and he wrote, I have taken Euclid as the guide with regard to geometrical and numerical laws. Euclid, of course, was the ancient Greek mathematician who worked in what's now called Euclidean geometry. But then Ibn Al-Haytham makes an interesting statement. He took the recently created mathematical discipline of algebra, which was developed by Musa al-Khwarizmi about 200 years earlier, and he applied algebra to geometry. He said, I have solved various geometrical problems and have explained numerical problems by means of equations. Now, when he did that, he founded what is a separate branch of mathematics called analytic geometry. And if he was not remembered for anything else, he would be remembered today as the father of analytic geometry. He had many interests. He also was interested in hydrodynamics. And he said, had I been in Egypt, I could have done something to regulate the Nile so the people could derive benefit from its ebb and flow, talking about the annual flooding of the Nile. And he proposed that he could build dams and canals on the Nile. Somehow, word of this treatise reached Caliph al-Hakim of the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa and Egypt. Meanwhile, Ibn al-Haytham is in Basra, in what is now Iraq, in the Abbasid Caliphate. But al-Hakim summoned him to Egypt to see if he could make good on this boast or this promise. So he traveled to Egypt, he surveyed the Nile, and he even found a location where he thought a dam could be built. But he felt that it wasn't feasible at that time. But hundreds of years later, that is the exact location where they built what's known as, this is the Low Aswan Dam. This was the first dam built on the Nile. He returned to Cairo and he explained that he didn't think it was feasible to Al-Hakim. And then Al-Hakim made him a minister or an advisor, put him in his cabinet, if you will. But something happened, and historians disagree about what happened. People at the time said that they thought that he had pretended to be insane. He had feigned madness. Now, in my book, I dispute that idea. I don't think he's the type of person that would do that. It would have been very difficult to do. I think it's possible he actually had some sort of mental disorder. Perhaps he was a high-functioning autistic. But for whatever reason, Caliph al-Hakim put him under house arrest. And he was under house arrest for 10 years until the death of al-Hakim. And the sources say that he was stripped of his possessions, of his books and his papers, and that he was basically alone for 10 years. And I hypothesize in my book, and I later hypothesize in my novel, that it was during this period that he turned his attention to the propagation of light and vision, how people see. And I tried to dramatize this story of these years in prison and in my novel, The Prisoner of Al-Hakim. It was during this period, or shortly afterwards, that he began these experiments on light and optics. And this experiment that I described in my photography book was much more complex than I thought it was. I understood from my source that he was just testing to see if light rays travel in straight lines. But actually, he had been thinking, if there are light rays that are reflected by all objects everywhere, they must intersect all over the place. And he asked a question. He says, it follows that these colors and lights will be mixed in the atmosphere and in the transparent bodies, and will have reached the eye mixed, and they will affect the body of eye while they are mixed, and thus neither the colors of the visible objects nor the objects themselves will be distinguished by the eye. Now, common sense tells us this doesn't happen, and he says this, but we do see things clearly. But he wanted to test. He wanted to create a test, and so he imagined this darkened room with an aperture so that he could basically force rays of light to cross, to intersect, to see if they would have any effect on each other. And he wrote, if lights blended in the atmosphere, the lights of the lamps meeting at the aperture would have mixed in the air at the aperture and in the air preceding it. And they would have come out so mingled together that they would not be subsequently distinguishable. We do not, however, find the matter to be so. Rather, the lights are found to come out separately, each being opposite the lamp from which it has arrived. In other words, light rays do not interfere with each other. And he was correct about this. When light rays are intersecting, they don't interfere except in one thing that he didn't have the technology to measure, which is when the wavelengths of the light rays are exactly the same, they will interfere. But all other light rays will not interfere. So, he showed this with his experiment. And he actually took it even further. He extinguished this lamp. Of course, that lamp, the projection went out, but then he examined the other two. And he did this over and over to see if they got brighter, if they got dimmer, if there was any effect on them at all. And there wasn't. So to me, what he was doing was very significant. I talked to Dr. Sabra about it, and he said, well, when an astronomer, as the Muslims and Islamic astronomers did, when they would predict an eclipse or they would predict a conjunction of the stars, then they would wait to see if it happened. That was like the scientific method, because they had a hypothesis and then they were testing the hypothesis. But to me, it's one thing to look at nature and make predictions about nature. It's something altogether different to imagine how to test a specific phenomenon and then to build something. It could be a very simple machine like a camera obscura to test that specific hypothesis. What's interesting about this is that Ibn Al-Haytham himself understood the importance of what he had done. He realized that experiments, what he called true demonstrations, were a turning point, not just in science. It was a turning point in his own life. He realized that all of his previous work that had relied on what he called persuasive methods of reasoning, that those were no longer valid. He says, we formally composed a treatise on optics in which we often followed persuasive methods of reasoning. But when true demonstrations relating to all objects of vision occurred to us, we started afresh the composition of this book. Whoever therefore comes upon said treatise must know that it should be discarded. And it is for that reason that I wrote my book, Ibn Al-Haytham, First Scientist. Now, what's interesting about Ibn Al-Haytham is his work was not a dead end. It traveled throughout the Islamic world. It made its way to Al-Andalus, which is we now call Spain. And there were some translators, Europeans who had gone to Toledo in Al-Andalus, and they translated the Book of Optics into Latin. And it became actually one of the first printed books was the Book of Optics, which they called De Aspectibus. And it was famous throughout Europe. Everyone knew about it. As I mentioned before, Roger Bacon put part of it into his Opus Majus. Everyone in Europe knew Ibn Al-Haytham and his accomplishments. And in fact, after Galileo invented the telescope, scientists made a map of the moon using the telescope. They made a map or an atlas of the moon, and they drew it and they engraved it and they printed it. And at the beginning of that atlas, there's what they call a frontispiece with the title and all of this. And there are two people depicted on that frontispiece, the two pillars of science. On the right, you see Galileo with his telescope. And on the left, wearing a turban and holding a geometric drawing, is Ibn Al-Haytham. His method, of course, he used it in physics, but it became the way that people studied everything. So in the physical sciences, chemistry, astronomy, the earth sciences, later in the life sciences of biology, physiology, zoology, and even more recently in the social sciences, psychology, anthropology, sociology, and political science, people must conduct experiments to test their hypotheses. In other words, Ibn Al-Haytham gave the world a way to determine the truth about nature. And this system that he devised, this methodology, has traveled throughout the world. It's used not just in the Middle East and not just in Europe or the Americas, but it's used in China. It's used everywhere in the world, his methodology. Now, Isaac Newton, the great English scientist, said, "If I have seen further, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants." And all scientists, and this is a little kind of a commemorative currency that was made, but here you see this gallery of scientists with Galileo on the right and Einstein in the middle, but they all stand on the shoulders of one man, and that's Ibn Al-Haytham. So he actually went into philosophy, just like his hero Aristotle there on the left with Plato on the right. He developed a way of knowing the truth, and this puts him in this gallery of philosophers, not just scientists, but of philosophers. Now, some people ask me, well, now what role did faith play in his development of the scientific method? And I think this is a very important point. His faith was extremely important. He wrote, when inquiry concerns subtle matters, perplexity grows, views diverge, opinions vary, conclusions differ, and certainty becomes difficult to attain. Truth is sought for itself, but the truths are immersed in uncertainties, and authorities are not immune from error, nor is human nature itself. Ibn Al-Haytham understood that the authorities, Aristotle and Euclid and they were not immune from error because they're human beings, and human nature itself is not immune from error. Only God is perfect. The seeker after truth must submit to him and his manifest laws in the universe, and not to the sayings of a human being whose nature is fraught with all kinds of imperfections and deficiencies. The seeker after truth is not one who studies the writings of the ancients and, following his natural disposition, puts his trust in them, but rather the one who suspects his faith in them and questions what he gathers from them, the one who submits to argument and demonstration. He understood that the way to understand the universe is to interact with it directly through experiment, to enter into a dialogue with the universe itself and with the Creator. Thus, the job of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads, and applying his mind to the core and margins of its content to attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. For we are not free from that human turbidity which is in the nature of man, but we must do our best with what we possess of human power. From God we derive support in all things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bradley. Thank you for the wonderful presentation as well. Now, I think if anyone has a question, he or she can type it, and I'm sure Mr. Steffens will be pleased to answer them. We already received some questions. So I will read the first question. After that, we will get the answer, then we will go on, if it is okay with you. Hello, can you hear me, Mr. Stephen?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, I will read the question, then you will answer, and we will proceed like this.
Okay.
Okay, the first question is that Ibn Al-Haytham was born after centuries of intensive activities in mathematics, astronomy, optics, and other physical sciences. Although he was preceded by great pioneers such as Aristotle, Al-Kindi, and others, what made his work very eminent?
Yes, now this is exactly what I was trying to get at. It's kind of a shame that he wasn't credited with something that has an Arabic name like algebra, because if you think about it, if you go to school, let's say I studied algebra here, and I said, well, where did this come from? Did it come from America? Did it come from England? You go back further to Europe, you go back further, and finally you come to one person, Musa al-Khwarizmi, who wrote the compendious book of balancing and calculation, which included the words algebra, and that's where we get the word algebra. In the same way, you can go back to the first person to use the specific scientific method of stating a hypothesis and then not just observing nature, but creating an apparatus to test that. Now, Al-Kindi did actually observe the flame through a tube, look at flame through a tube to establish that light rays traveled in straight lines. And there were, I'm not saying that there weren't scientists before Ibn Al-Haytham, because even he talked about them. But the key difference with him was two things. He says in his book of optics that he's not going to put anything in it unless he can prove it with a calculation or with a true demonstration. And he, as I said, he said anything that it relies on reasoning is just not going to work anymore. So he is really the first person to systematically apply the scientific method, systematically insist on experimentation. So that is, to me, that's what makes him unique.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bradley. Well, we have a question also. The question says, as youth, what role can we play to revive the work of Ibn Al-Haytham and other Muslim scientists to maintain our heritage of the past?
I included a couple of those quotes at the end because his emphasis on critical thinking was, I think, quite remarkable and quite modern. In other words, he's saying, don't take my opinion, don't take me as an authority. Everyone must approach every scientist and every authority and to look at them and to use critical thinking to see if what they say is true. And I think that's the big lesson for today, is to remember that he emphasized as a person, as a human being. I mean, he's just so remarkably modern in the things he says, the way he looks at truth and knowing the truth. And that critical thinking is essential to knowing the truth. So that's one thing. The other thing is, at least in the West, there's this concept that religion and science are like opposites, or like they are, at war with each other, where he understood science as a way to come to know the universe, and through the universe to know the Creator. And so I feel like if there's something from his heritage that I would like to see continued, it's this belief that knowledge brings us closer to God.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for the brilliant response. We have a question also. The question says, how did Ibn Al-Haytham change the course of science?
Right. So it's very interesting that his influence, it took time. It actually, as I showed, it took centuries for his book to be translated and to affect scientists in Europe. In the Middle East, there were changes toward looking at science for its own sake. Scientists were incorporated into the mosques and so forth to make predictions for the timing of Ramadan and for Eid, and everything was sort of absorbed into the faith rather than knowledge for its own sake. This is why, in part, why the Europeans, when they got a hold of this method, because the method works, and they simply began to apply it. And there was this great surge of knowledge in Europe at that time. So this method of experiment is what affected the future of all science. And I think it's very interesting to see that it was adapted. It's been adapted by everybody. It's been refined. There are those who will say, well, he was proving the positive. He was proving things to be true, but he wasn't also proving the negative. There's a step in the scientific method where it became more advanced. But I still say if you go back, this is the man who really systematically applied the scientific method.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. A question from Syed Ibrahim, our brother. He asks that, what is the role of contribution of Ibn Al-Haytham in Renaissance?
Yes, it's very interesting that his book of optics was one of the first printed books, and that there's some evidence that Leonardo himself used the camera obscura, and other artists used the camera obscura or camera functioning, the pinhole technology, to do paintings. There's been an analysis, the British artist David Hockney has done an analysis of, and he's a great painter, by the way, but he did an analysis of some of these paintings where there are many people, and he noticed that the lines of perspective on each face, that it's not one line of perspective, that each face was done individual, and he has hypothesized that these paintings, the reason there was this tremendous advance in art in Europe was that they were using the camera obscura to project images and then put on the canvas points like the centers of the eyes, the tip of the nose, the corners of the mouth, the key measurements. Then the artist could, fill in the rest from memory, but to get the measurements exactly right. So he had a tremendous influence on art as well as on science. And so when we think of the Renaissance, we think of this new knowledge that people looked at the Greeks, and then they expanded on that knowledge, and they found that the Greeks had been wrong about many things, and knowledge just took off. And his book, if he had only written it and then we discovered it 1,000 years later, that would be important. But his book was significant because every scientist in Europe knew about him and his work.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. We have a question from Abdullah from Gambia. His question is, from a philosophical point of view, it is obvious Ibn Al-Haytham will always surpass his contemporaries and even future philosophers. Is his religious standing an advantage in certain aspects, as science sometimes comes to a halt in certain things that proves elusive, which in most times it is answers found in, for example, Islamic texts? Can this be a factor?
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't know how one would actually, test that or prove that, but it seems to me logical. First, he was inspired by the Quran to, the Quran says that we study the heavens and the earth, and that we should be seekers after knowledge. And I think all Muslims are inspired by the Quran to seek knowledge and to seek knowledge about the world. And this is a little bit different than other religions, and I think it was a very important factor. And even today, I mean, as I was just referring to this war between religion and science in the West, where there is no such war. If you follow the Quran, there's no problem. With a lot of things that are problems in the West are not problems in the Quran. For example, the existence of extraterrestrial life is not a problem according to the Quran, where this would be, I think there would be some Christians who have a big problem with if there's extraterrestrial life, because it would kind of shoot holes in their theories. So I think that his being a Muslim is absolutely essential to his development and perhaps even to his influence.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. We have another question. Today we face the post-truth era. Can we learn something from Ibn Al-Haytham and other Muslim mid-age scientists to against this problem, especially to remind the flat earthian, etc.?
I didn't quite catch the last part of that question.
I will repeat the question again. Today we face the post-truth era. Can we learn something from Ibn Al-Haytham and other Muslim mid-age scientists to against this problem, especially to remind the flat earthian?
Yeah, that's a really good question also. I also, the world has changed so much, even in my lifetime. It's incredible. It's true. I mean, I've just been amazed at things, not in a good way, by the way. I'm not saying in a good way. I'm saying that people have lost touch with some very important values, it seems to me. So again, I would say that critical thinking is a very important aspect. If people are able to, and it takes effort, and people get tired at the end of the day and they don't really want to think critically about things. But certainly in the field of rhetoric, where you learn to identify logical fallacies and so forth, and how many people, how many speakers use logical fallacies. I mean, they don't even think about them. It's so normal to them that if you think critically, you know, that to me is a key. So even in the field of rhetoric, I think it's important to learn about logical arguments and illogical arguments, and to think critically. But I really don't have an answer for that. I wish I did.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bradley. Okay, let me read the final question. Why is the modern world indebted to Ibn Al-Haytham?
So this would be some of the same things that I've just said. It's indebted in a way that we've adopted. I just find it so odd that we've adopted this methodology. We've adopted this way of knowing the truth. I mean, for example, I was serving on a jury in a trial, and you have the attorneys up there. And in the old days, attorneys complain about this. They say in the old days, they could make arguments, logical arguments, to convict, let's say, convict someone based on circumstantial evidence. And yet today, juries are so expectant of having physical proof. They want the DNA, they want the fingerprint, they want a thread, they want some physical proof that a crime was committed by a certain person. And the judicial system, you know, it still allows for what Ibn Al-Haytham called persuasive reasoning. But this just shows that the scientific method has penetrated every aspect of our life, not just science. You don't have to be a scientist. You know, when they have a cola competition, they have a blind taste test. Which of these colas taste best? It's a blind taste test so that people are not influenced by the marketing, by the brand name. It's only the taste. This is the scientific method at work. And no matter what the area or field is, everyone uses this method to discover the truth about things. And so it's just amazing to me that we can go back, and we can say, well, Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra, and yet for some reason the world still has yet to acknowledge, well, where did science begin? Who's the guy who came up with that idea? And I just find it amazing that let me put it this way. There are these lists of the 100 greatest books ever written. You know, the books that influenced the world, the Communist Manifesto, or you know, something by Descartes, or something like this. Various books, most important books. To me, the most important book today was the Book of Optics. This was the turning point, not just of science, but this was the turning point in human history. This was the beginning of the modern age, because he introduced us to a method that has changed everything in the last 1,000 years. And he did it in a specific book. And in that book, he says that you must discard the other books that were done that don't follow this method. So to me, his achievement is still not fully appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley. Ladies and gentlemen, respected viewers and audience, finally, we come to the end of our presentation. I am delighted to have the opportunity to wrap up this insightful session. Mr. Steffens stated that Ibn Al-Haytham was an Arab mathematician, astronomer, and physicist of the Islamic Golden Age, also sometimes referred to as the father of modern optics. He made significant contributions to the principles of optics and visual perception in particular. He mentioned about Al-Haytham experiments with light, scientific method. He talked about Aristotle's and Galileo, and the optics of Ibn Al-Haytham book, and he mentioned that the book was translated to English from Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the ICYF President and ICYF Secretariat, we would like to say thanks again, Mr. Bradley Steffens, for the informative and insightful session, and to the audiences, of course, for their active participation. Please stay tuned and follow our social media accounts for our forthcoming events. Thank you for your attention, and may God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley.